About 5 years ago, my mom started dating a guy that she'd met on a dating site. The online dating is fine. I had recently started dating a woman who would later become my wife, and we'd met online as well. Both my girlfriend, who would later become my wife, and myself never liked this guy. We thought he was a weirdo literally from day one. We didn't think he was mean or anything like that, just creepy. He was quiet. He kept his eyes closed a lot, occasionally saying odd things, like offering my wife a chocolate, then popping one in his mouth and closing his eyes, then moaning as he let it melt in his mouth. It was all stuff that just teetered on inappropriate, but also kind of reminded me of special needs individuals I personally known as well in my life. I don't mean that in a disparaging way in the slightest, just in the sense that I wondered how much control this guy had over his thoughts and his words. One time my wife and I were visiting my mom, but she got called into work, so we waited at her house. Her boyfriend was over, and he spent the entire several hours that night just hanging out in her bedroom with the door closed. We could hear noises every now and again, but for the most part, it sounded like he was just lying totally still in there. Really creeped us out because we didn't know what to do. We ended up just waiting it out, but maybe be a little bit more of a host next time. Just before Christmas, my mom and this guy start having some difficulties. My wife and I were visiting for the holidays. She dropped all of her problems on us, and we listened carefully, gave our opinions, and suggested that she might be better off without him. She had already made her mind up, though, and decided to break up with him on Christmas Eve. I couldn't help but smile. Of course, she'd been lying out this entire plan, down to the day of when to do it, and then explained it to us purely for confirmation. What I was smiling about was that she'd already lured us into the house for the holiday weekend. We're going to be stuck in the crossfire after she dumps this guy. All I can imagine is him quietly collecting his belongings before murdering us in our sleep. Thanks, Mom. We spent the night at my mom's and got up early on Christmas morning to visit my dad at his house. We didn't plan to spend the night at my dad's, but we got snowed in, which was actually a nice Christmas surprise. We had avoided the entire breakup conversation the night before, and then got out of there pretty much the moment the sun rise, and we were happy to be now stuck in my dad's. The next day we left as soon as we could, to get through the snow. My wife suggested that we stop by my mom's house on the way, make sure that she was okay. My wife just had a really bad feeling about that ex-boyfriend. I couldn't blame her. That whole weekend was like a perfect murder setup. It was a holiday weekend, fresh blankets of snow, family members coming and going, adding to the chaos. With my mom and that guy snowed in alone, the reality became more clear that there was potentially danger at hand. My mom's car was in the driveway, but that doesn't really mean much. She lives close enough to work that she actually walks often. She never locks her door, which drives me crazy, so we let ourselves in. That's when we see blood oozing out of the refrigerator's water dispenser. It had filled up the spill container and was leaking onto the floor and made this giant puddle. My wife screamed and I freaked out. I fully expected to see my mom's head in the freezer. The house is caught in this eerie half-light. No sound or movement. There doesn't seem to be anyone around. I holler both of their names into the house and get no response. A sour pit is churning in my stomach, and I'm starting to really entertain the idea that the worst has happened. It's not hard to do when you're seeing exactly what you didn't want to see. I nervously opened the freezer to find a bag of frozen cherries that had been opened, crammed into the freezer so that it fell onto the ice dispenser and then melted. My mom turned out to be in the shower just warming up. Ex-boyfriend was nowhere to be found. We told her about the cherry incident, to which she gave us this funny look and asked us to show her. She claims she never even bought frozen cherries. Didn't have any. Those weren't hers. We think the ex-boyfriend bought them, opened them, and then arranged them in the freezer so they'd thaw and drip, like a weird, ominous power move. For Dayton, Ohio, Christmas time of 1992 would become synonymous with a group whose name would haunt the city for many, many years to come, the Downtown Posse. Since their meeting during a night of drinking just 2 weeks prior, 22-year-old Marvalis Keene and his 16-year-old girlfriend Laura Taylor had been inseparable. Laura had recently been kicked out of her parents' house. She had no job and had quickly become financially dependent on Marvalis, who had burned through what little cash he had, keeping her entertained. Around 2 weeks before Christmas, the couple spent the last of their cash on a single night stay in a downtown Dayton hotel and were desperate for money. Fortunately, Laura had an idea. She knew a man named Joseph Wilkerson who had a rather lucrative job at General Motors, a man who spent a sizable amount of his disposable income on sexual deviancy. The plan was simple. Laura would call Joseph, invite him to an orgy in exchange for a sizable amount of cash. Once they knew he had the cash on hand, they could get into his home with the help of a fellow member, Heather Matthews, and rob him. But the raid turned into something far more horrific than a simple smash and grab. On Christmas Eve, once Marvalis, Heather, and Laura had forced their way into Joseph's home at 3321 Prescott Avenue, they tied him to a bed with electrical cord, torturing him until he gave up the cash. But once the money was secured, Marvalis used a .32 caliber Derringer to execute their victim, so he couldn't report them to the police. After the murder, the trio made themselves at home, raiding Joseph's fridge and playing loud music before stealing his car, which now facilitated their killing spree. What came next can only be described as a frenzy of violence. The next victim was Danita Gillette, who was shot multiple times while using a payphone at 517 Neal Avenue. There was no plan this time. It seemed like they just shot a totally random person in the middle of the street before jumping out of a stolen car and taking her shoes, jacket, and a backpack. After they were apprehended by the police, the surviving members of the downtown posse would admit that the sole motivation for Danita's cold-blooded murder was to steal her brand new sneakers. The third victim that night was a man named Jeffrey Wright, who was shot 4 times while standing outside of 157 Yuma Place. Thankfully, he was lucky enough to survive the attack, but as it turned out, Jeffrey had a personal connection to the group. He was the ex-boyfriend of Heather Matthews, who was, by that time, in a relationship with another downtown posse member, DeMarcus Smith, and it was he who pulled the trigger 4 times, hitting Jeffrey in both legs. Fortunately, he was able to escape to a neighbor's house and get himself some medical assistance. The downtown posse then rested for the night, but planned on resuming their spree the very next day. As the sun set on Christmas Day 1992, the group had decided on their next victim, a man named Richard Maddox, and he too had a connection to the posse. He was Laura Taylor's ex-boyfriend, who was lured from his parents' house with the promise of reconciliation. He picked her up in his car, and the pair then drove around discussing their past relationship. But unbeknownst to Richard, the rest of the downtown posse followed close behind. Richard soon figured out that he was being tailed. He grew nervous and attempted to make a quick getaway. And that's when Laura put the Derringer pistol to his head and pulled the trigger, killing him instantly. Then as the car was about to crash, Laura threw herself out of the moving vehicle and was then picked up by the fellow gang members. On the following day, Sarah Abraham was working at the family-owned Shortstop Mini Market on West 5th Street when the posse entered the store. Once again, Laura Taylor seemed to be leading the group in selecting their victims, scouting ahead and entering the store first to ensure that they would not be overwhelmed or outnumbered. She was followed by DeMarcus and Marvalis, who shot Sarah in the face before wounding a customer who was just picking up groceries. Sarah would survive for 5 days in the hospital, but eventually, she would succumb to the complications stemming from those wounds. Immediately following that Shortstop shooting, the posse made their way to Salem Avenue, where they found a woman airing up her tires at a gas station. As soon as the woman saw them approaching with guns drawn, she fled. But it wasn't this that saved her life. It later came to light that Laura Taylor had demanded that Marvalis shoot her as soon as she ran, but he hesitated, and the woman was able to make her escape. It's a highly disturbing detail that the youngest and seemingly most innocent of the 4 was evidently the most bloodthirsty. The posse then stole the woman's black Dodge Shadow, the same car that was pulled over in a traffic stop that led to their arrest. In the aftermath of them being apprehended, the group told the police where to find 2 more bodies, those of Wendy Cottrell and Marvin Washington. Their bodies were at the city-owned gravel dump, located at 1654 Richley Drive. These 2 were members of the posse that Laura Taylor ordered the execution of because she believed they knew too much and would break under police pressure. They told the 2 soon-to-be victims They all wanted to party and told them to get in the car. A short while later, Marvalis pulled the car over into the gravel pit, ordered Wendy and Marvin to get out, and then he and DeMarcus shot them in cold blood. It's terrifying that the downtown posse quickly went from killing for financial gain to just killing for the thrill of it, and all during the most festive time of the year, when families of the victims would have been extra devastated to learn their loved one's demise, given that Christmas is such a family-oriented holiday. Perhaps the only solace we can take in this case is to learn that Marvalis Keene was executed for his part in the murders, and the families of the victims managed to get some measure of justice. Back when I was about 6 or 7, we were visiting my aunt for Christmas. She had just divorced her husband. He was a hot-headed Czechoslovakian guy who had started to go a little off the deep end. He called the house multiple times over the past few days, threatening my aunt, but nothing had ever come from it. We'd kind of dealt with the temper and flare-ups the entire course of their relationship, so it wasn't really anything new. The only part that was difficult was that we were hearing him freak out through the phone, not in person. This was actually kind of nice compared to the normal routine. Try not to placate a middle-aged guy with a bad attitude. My parents and I had just immigrated to Canada, which is where the story was taking place, so we were spending the night at my aunt's before the house was ready. We were lounging for the holidays and just enjoying a little family time. There was hot cocoa, caramel popcorn, all the fixings for a good time. While my aunt was sitting in the den, she happened to glance up and saw her ex coming towards the house with a hunting rifle. She screamed to my dad with balls of steel flew into action, locking the door and then running myself, my aunt, and my mother up the stairs, and then locking us in a room. We put a dresser in front of the door while my dad grabbed a buck knife and then ran back downstairs. I was in shock watching him grab a weapon and go back toward the danger. He was totally calm, ready to deliver certain death to this clown who thought he was going to surprise us. I learned in those few seconds, watching my father gather himself and then go downstairs, never to mess with that man. Never. Not even as a joke. The rest of the story I only know because it's been told to me. Basically, my mom called the police from the upstairs phone. Meanwhile, my aunt's ex busted open the door near where my dad was hiding and then entered the home. My dad waited for him to take a few steps into the main room before he jumped out from the corner and hit him over the head with something. I think my dad thought it would knock the guy out cold, but all it ended up doing was getting him to drop the rifle. This wasn't a bad alternative. My dad continued the assault, which kind of turned into a raw fist fight there in the foyer. I don't know what happened to the knife. I assumed it was involved at least in the initial back and forth scuffle, but he never confirmed nor denied if he stabbed that guy. With the look that my dad had on his face that day, I'm almost positive he knifed him at least once. The police showed up and arrested my aunt's ex. But the scariest part about all this was, my aunt's ex's father was found hiding in the backyard when the police did a sweep about the house. He was this old abusive drunk that hated my aunt too. He'd been waiting in the backyard with a knife, hoping we'd run out there. He was way scarier than his son. He had a real rap sheet of aggravated assaults and more things like that. Had my father tried to usher us out back, we would have been dead in that moment. He really saved us that day with his quick thinking and quicker action. Situational awareness is one thing, but having the brass to react is definitely something else. The father ended up getting deported. The ex went to jail and then had a restraining order for years to come. Although he still claims they only wanted to scare us, it was a horrifying experience, hearing all that commotion from downstairs while we were all hidden away. All I know is, based on my dad's bravery and the beating he must have put on that guy, we've gotten to enjoy many more Christmases. On the 25th of December in 2014, 36-year-old Dustin Lee Klopp dialed 911 from his home in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. When they asked what the nature of his emergency was, Dustin told the dispatcher that he required police assistance as a domestic disturbance had occurred at his home. He refused to elaborate any further, and when assured that the officers had been dispatched to his location, Dustin hung up the phone. Upon their arrival at Dustin's home, the police officers received no answer after knocking on his front door. The scenes of domestic disputes are often extremely noisy and extremely volatile, but in this case, there was nothing but a dead silence on the other side of the door. The officers began circling the perimeter of the house, peering into the windows before making their way into the backyard. The place seemed completely deserted, and for a moment, the officers believed they may have gotten to the wrong address. Just as they were about to radio dispatch for some more clarification, one of the officers passed a small shed Dustin had kept in his backyard and detected the telltale smell of rotten flesh emanating from its interior. After fetching a pair of bolt cutters from their patrol car, the officers gained access to the shed, and after a brief search, discovered a dismembered human corpse stuffed into a gym bag. It was quickly determined the deceased was Stephanie Kilhefner, the common-law wife of Dustin Lee Klopp, and soon after, the police officers came to a horrifying conclusion. Dustin had absconded with the couple's 2 daughters, and if he'd murdered their mother, there's no telling what he had planned for them. Local law enforcement rushed into action, setting up roadblocks while requesting additional units from neighboring counties. Within just a half an hour, a gigantic web of roadblocks and police patrols sought to trap Dustin in Lancaster County, but the effort proved fruitless. Because right around the same time the entire county was being sealed off, Dustin simply walked into a state police barracks and handed himself in. "My name is Dustin Lee Klopp," he told the officers at the front desk, "and I just killed my wife." As they escorted him into an interview room, homicide detectives were struck by how calm Dustin was and how he remained that way as he described the events of the previous night. At around 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve, Dustin and his wife began to argue. Their relationship had already been steadily unraveling, but the copious amounts of alcohol exacerbated an already tense situation until the atmosphere became downright volatile. Dustin explained how his wife had started to fiercely berate him after he attempted to walk away from the argument. Stephanie then directed so many vile insults at Dustin, he claimed to simply snap. He saw red and attacked her. With one single strike, Dustin knocked Stephanie unconscious, and as she lay before him groaning, she gradually came around. But he knew there was no turning back now. Stephanie would use this incident to financially and socially destroy him. She'd take the kids, she'd take the house, and she'd take almost half of his salary for as long as he continued to hold the job. This drunken mistake would prove nothing short of catastrophic for him, unless he committed the unthinkable. At that, Dustin walked into the family's kitchen, retrieved the sharpest knife that he could find. He kneeled next to his wife's body, brought the blade up to her throat, sliced open her jugular in a spray of fresh blood. He then walked into his home's backyard, grabbed a large axe he'd been using to chop wood for a smoker, then, in his own words, split her head open with it. He spent the remainder of the evening chopping up Stephanie's body, all while their 2 sleeping daughters slept peacefully upstairs, completely ignorant of the horror that had unfolded downstairs. By morning, Dustin had removed almost all evidence of the crime, all except his wife's corpse. After stuffing her remains into the gym bag and hiding it in the shed, he hoped the cold might mask the stench of death. He then drove his children over to his parents' house under the pretense of spending Christmas at their place. To them, it was a pleasant surprise, and neither party thought too much of it as Dustin drove back to home to place that fateful phone call. Overcome with guilt, Dustin briefly considered suicide. The idea of facing the media firestorm that would inevitably follow seemed far too much to bear. But instead of taking his own life, Dustin decided to face judgment. His courage only lasted a few months though, as in early 2015, Dustin hung himself in his cell at Lancaster County Prison. His attempt was interrupted by a prison guard, but the intervention came far too late. He was declared clinically brain dead just a week later, slipping away shortly after life support was withdrawn. Crimes like this are a prime example of why restraint and de-escalation are so important. When Dustin lost his temper with his wife, he not only lost the moral high ground, he kicked off a chain of events that would end in both of their deaths. At a time when families should be coming together, putting aside their differences to spend quality time together. Dustin Lee Klopp chose to doom his own. I was driving from Cheyenne up to Butte, Montana, and the first part is generally windy with chances of the road closing due to the wind being common. I was about half a mile behind a pickup truck, pulling a travel trailer, when I saw that it started to get loose. I myself regularly pulled a 28-foot travel trailer myself, and had spent a few days and nights sitting in Douglas, Wyoming, waiting for the winds to die down so I could finish my drive. When I say winds, I mean catastrophic air movements, sometimes upward of 75 miles per hour. The southern belt of Wyoming can actually be a record setter for winds. The average is usually over 50 miles per hour for the year. Casper held the highest rate of suicide per capita in the world, and there's barely 60,000 people living there. Many attribute this to the wind driving them crazy, day after day. Anyway, I start mumbling to myself about using the trailer brakes to straighten it out, when he went sideways and into the center of the divided highway. It jackknifed and rolled, so I yelled some curses. I was a brand new dad at the time, so I'd been thinking extra about my own mortality. There's nothing like someone else on the road, not just putting themselves at risk, but everyone else around them too. I'm a former EMT, so I was preparing myself to help save some guy's life when I rounded the corner and saw it. The truck was on its side. He had landed on the driver's head, partially detached outside of the vehicle, with his body inside and a small section of ligament keeping it attached. Basically, his head smashed through the driver's window of this truck as it rolled, and then the truck decapitated him as it shifted on its side along the roadway. I could see a path of blood where the open wounds had dug through the snow. At the end of this little bloody trail is a severed human head, still bleeding while the snow lands in its hair. I look in the front window and saw no one else inside, and slowly walked back to my truck, mumbling about who knows what. I called law enforcement, explained the situation and the scene, and then the location. I asked if they needed me to stay, and dispatch told me no. My information was enough. I drove a long way in silence. I even cried some thinking about my 8-month-old boy, and what his life would be like without me. I saw myself driving that truck and hauling that trailer, as that's how my wife and I lived for about 8 years. We pulled that thing all over, rain or shine, any time of the year. Count your blessings. First off, I'm living very rural, in a small village with maybe 10 to 15 houses, but close to the highway. You can drive there within maybe 5 minutes. It's also about 10 minutes away from town. If you cross the street, it just takes you about a 10-minute walk to reach the forest. First Christmas Day, in the afternoon, my partner and I decided to go for a little digestive walk. We were really stuffed from all the food. It was around 5 p.m. and already dark when we left. We had this big and bright LED flashlight with us, and I also took my camera and my flash, as I love taking pictures of nature at night. We decided to walk on a little country road towards the forest, and then turn right, following a small gravel cycle track close to the forest border, which connects our village and the next. In the middle part of the track, you have to walk through a small bit of forest. It's rather dark and the trees are very high and quite dense. When we entered, I saw my flashlight reflecting on something and recognized a car being parked there on the side of the track, close to the trees. This struck me as odd. Cars are not allowed to drive there, and the path is very narrow and hidden, so I was a bit cautious. My partner pointed the light inside of the car, and it seemed to be empty. I also noticed that the windows were frozen, so it must have been parked there for quite some time. A bit in front of the car, I spotted a tree with this intriguing structure. I asked my partner to point the flashlight toward it, so I could better focus and photograph it with my flash. After I took a few images, my partner told me, there's someone standing behind us in the middle of the road. He's looking at us. Nobody was following us that whole way until now. I'd looked behind me occasionally, because at this time in the evening and so close to the border of the forest, there's sometimes boars. Indeed, now there was a man standing behind us, staying just out of the flashlight's reach, He wasn't saying anything, just standing there and facing us. At first, I thought he might be startled, as it may seem a bit weird if someone's just taking photos around your car. I decided to get up and confront him from a distance, explaining to him that I was just taking photos of that tree. He didn't react, he just stood there. I then went on to ask him if he needed some light, and he replied that that wasn't necessary. It was odd, but I was still calm. Sure, there has to be a normal explanation for all this behavior. Nonetheless, my partner and I just decided to get out of there and follow the path leading to the next village. I remembered the letters on his license plate and Googled it. It turned out he was from a city about 6 hours away from us. Mind you, the country that I live in is in a very strict lockdown right now, so you're only allowed to travel even by car if you have very urgent reasons. After we reached the first lantern in the next village, we looked back and observed the car driving a bit out of the forest, turning around and then going back inside. I was able to see that he parked there again and turned the lights off. He didn't leave the forest. We went home on a much longer way than initially intended, and I didn't want to go back there for obvious reasons. Our flashlight battery died on the way, and my phone battery was low, so I didn't want to call the police back then, but I called them as soon as I arrived home and gave them all the details that I can remember. I think I was very lucky to have my partner and that camera, as well as that bright light with me. I don't want to imagine what could have happened if I was all alone. On the evening of December 22nd, 1989, the Harris family of Dryden, New York, received the final visitor of their lives. One after the other, Tony Harris, his wife Dolores, and their 2 younger children were tied up, shot in the head, doused with gasoline, and then set alight. Their charred corpses were discovered the following morning, after a neighbor complained to the fire department about a smoke alarm going off on their property. Disturbingly, the police stated that the Harris' home showed no signs of forced entry, leading them to believe that their killer had either snuck in through an open door or maybe a window, but was highly unlikely, given the frigid outdoor temperatures, or that the killer was someone they knew and trusted. In light of how difficult it was to discern any kind of motive, the investigation into the murders quickly stalled, and local law enforcement reached out to the FBI for more extensive assistance. FBI agents discovered that a brown van had been taken from the Harris' family garage, one that was later discovered in a parking lot of a nearby mall. Police also declared that they wished to speak with a cyclist seen riding through the area shortly before nightfall on December 22nd. Frustratingly, not a single witness came forward, and this further slowed an already difficult investigation. Back at the Harris' home, Christmas wreaths and red ribbons had been joined by yellow crime scene tape. The family had moved there just 3 years prior, after Tony was offered a job at Deanco, a Syracuse-based electronic equipment distributor. His wife Dolores, or Dodie as she was known, was a popular figure in the neighborhood, frequently organizing bake sales and cookie exchanges while running a small crafts and gift shop out of the family home. The murders stunned the local community, with Tompkins County Sheriff Robert Howard stating that there hadn't been a murder in the area in a long time. Naturally, the Harris' neighbors were horrified by such a brutal slaying, who stated that their suburb of Ellis Hollow was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked. For a horrific crime to happen there, something had to have gone very wrong. At the family's collective funeral, loved ones and neighbors described them as active and well-liked members of the community. "You can't think of anyone that would have a grudge against them," said Ann Parzale, a friend of Mrs. Harris. "People can't understand how it could happen. This is a very wholesome, family-oriented community. Those things aren't supposed to happen here, inside this community," added Edgar Clemens, who was a retired school teacher and had lived on Ellis Hollow Road for 26 years. "I don't think anybody around here slept Saturday night. I've opened the door to people whose cars have broken down. I don't think I'll do that anymore." Police quickly uncovered a suspect, however, an ex-con known as Michael Kinge, and set about tracking him down. Yet when they finally cornered him at his apartment complex, Kinge produced a shotgun, placed it under his chin, and threatened to kill himself. The cops held their fire, promising to bring in a trained negotiator in hopes of de-escalating the situation. But before that negotiator could arrive, Kinge aimed the shotgun at police officers and fired. Thankfully, the shot sent lead fragments spraying harmlessly above their heads, and law enforcement's return fire was considerably more accurate. But before he fell, Kinge turned the shotgun on himself, racked a shell into the chamber, and fired. The Tompkins County medical examiner found that the shots Kinge fired in his attempt at suicide had merely grazed the left side of his face, and it was the police's small caliber handgun ammunition that actually put him down. However, given the circumstances of Kinge firing a shot at them, his death was ruled a justifiable homicide. Obviously, Kinge was never put on trial for the murders, but his suicide by cops situation was seen by many as a tantamount to his admission of guilt. This was later confirmed when a sawed-off rifle found in the suspect's apartment was positively identified as the weapon used to kill the Harris family. Kinge's mother was wrongly convicted of being involved in the murders and ended up being a major police scandal. But aside from this horrifying miscarriage of justice, the really disturbing thing is that the motive behind the killings was never determined. No one knows why a small-time crook like Michael Kinge just suddenly snapped and chose the most wonderful time of the year for one of the most heinous crimes in history. I've known for a while that I wanted to submit this story, but I felt odd about it since I'm still friends with some of the guy's family and would feel like a total shitbag if it was ever seen. However, I've been home with the kids reading today and got pissed that I read all of your stories and was fresh out of creepy material. So to be part of the solution, I guess, here we go. I'm a member of the slam poetry scene. Basically, it's an excuse to get people to listen to a performance poetry by adding a competitive element to things. After running through the small scene in my city and wanting to branch out and push my career further, I started visiting places within driving distance that I could spit. This led me to Charlotte, North Carolina. I started on their local team venue, where you compete to be a part of a squad that goes to a national competition every year. I was doing well and was accepted into the local crew pretty readily. This led to longer stays and features at some of the other venues in the city. I started going to one that was particularly popular. It was good for selling CDs, and this is where I met this guy. He worked as a barback, occasionally got on stage and shared. Frankly, it was always shitty poems. He was the brother of the host and everyone knew and liked him. He began flirting with me more and more. Although in my loose days, searching for acceptance and love everywhere, something always kept me leery. I'd gladly accept the drinks he sent over, smoke his weed with the group in the stockroom between sets, and hang out at parties and other events. But I always had this tickle in my gut, warning me to not get close. But over a year or two, we continued to become friends. After a while, he started calling and texting me more often, poking me on Facebook daily, sending messages about wanting to be more than friends, and he wanted to find a snow bunny and settle down. Again, I never entertained it. There's just something gnawing at me. The crazy in his eyes was too hard to miss. Eventually, I moved to Denver to take a position teaching poetry and work at a friend's law firm. The second Christmas that I was there, I got a call. One of my friends from Charlotte relayed the following message. He'd found his white girl and gotten married. They seemed happy at first, but slowly began fighting more and more. It spilled over into the venue, and often they had to be separated by friends from physically attacking one another in public. One friend, later thinking back, remembers the last time that she saw them together. Him pushing his wife, following by her throwing a drink in his face, and scratching his neck deep enough to draw blood. She said after the couple had been dragged away from each other, she sat with him and smoked a cigarette. She says she laughed and said, "You guys are gonna kill each other." Around Christmas of last year, his wife stopped coming to the bi-weekly events they both attended regularly. He explained it away that they were on a break. Time goes by. No one really questions that they hadn't seen or heard from her in quite a while, thinking she was breaking from the whole scene in order to put distance between herself and her husband. Her parents, however, hadn't heard from their daughter since Thanksgiving dinner. They would call him, and he would say everything was fine and blow them off. This continues until a week after Christmas. knowing their daughter would never miss a holiday, at least without a call. They call the police and send them over to the couple's home for a well body check. The cops arrive. They knock on the door and are let in. They ask him where she is. He replies that she's still in the bedroom. He shows them to the room where she lay there, dead for weeks, rotting in their bed. Oh, and he killed her little dog too. During this time, he'd been attending events, hosting hip-hop nights, and even publishing a blog on making a marriage work on one of the local organization sites, never once letting on that every night he was going home and sleeping with his murdered wife. The sickest part of all of this, he is a child from another relationship, a daughter whom he gets to celebrate with every other holiday. That Christmas they opened gifts, had dinner, cuddled up on the couch and watched movies, less than 100 feet from her decaying stepmother. I don't know what would have happened if I'd ever taken him up on the offer to date. But I do know me and my gut are going to stay on speaking terms, and I will always listen to it. This happened in December of 2011 when I was on a college semester break. I grew up in rural Texas with about 1,000 people in my hometown. Shortly after my parents divorced, I moved to a larger city for college and made it a tradition every year to visit my family for the holidays in the boonies of Texas. After the divorce, my mom had recently moved to a nearby town, only 100 people, where her house was located. It was on the very outskirts of town, surrounded by miles and miles of cornfields in almost every direction. There was a side paved road that was about 100 feet off of her house that basically was a dead end until you reached a certain point. Then directly across the other side of the road was in fact miles of fields of corn. The only neighbor that she had was half a mile north of her house, who was a truck driver and was basically never home much of the year. I'm telling you all of this so you know how secluded my mother's house really truly was. The closest town from here was 15 to 20 miles away. This winter break was different because my mother and brother were going to travel to Boston to visit my grandparents. My mom needed someone to sit the dog. After a few days of having the house to myself in the middle of nowhere, I'm getting kind of bored. So I decide to put the harness on my dog and take a walk out into the area in no particular direction. We end up following that dead-end road and then turn back as it starts to get darker. The wind's picking up because a cold front was coming through. At this time, I'm slightly more frustrated with myself because I could start to smell the rain. My dog can be particularly stubborn. He likes to walk me instead of the other way around. Anyway, as we start walking back, it's getting colder and colder. Now it's drizzling, and I'm walking a bit faster. We're damn near almost to a jog, heading back to the house, when all of a sudden, my dog stops abruptly. Initially, I just think it's him being stubborn, but he starts leading me in the direction of the cornfield. I'm thinking this is one of those cases where he just locks onto a scent and just cannot let it go until he directly goes up to it, or I have to pick him back up and lead him back on track. I don't allow him to get very far, and we're directly in front of the fields. And then all of a sudden, he starts barking, similar to how he barks when he sees another person, and he's not friendly to other people. I finally get tired of all this. I pick him up and we run back home, both now damp and cold. Once back inside, I dry up and take a bath. It's now evening time. I make something to eat, and my dog and I start winding down for the night. We watch a bit of TV in the living room, and by 10 p.m., we call it for the night. It's still very much windy outside this time though, and that storm never really died down. We go into the bedroom. My dog burrows underneath the blankets, and I pass out shortly after. Several hours later, I wake up to my dog growling on my bed in the direction of the window. I hear rustling outside, and I think it's likely just another animal, but I'm still kind of drowsy, so I get out of bed and pick up my dog to corral him to the living room, where I turn on the TV to drown out those rustling noises. My dog burrows underneath the blankets again, and I'm just about to fall asleep when I hear a thud outside. I'm like, what the hell was that? And of course, my dog is now wide awake again, barking and growling underneath the blankets. I'm wide awake now and getting annoyed with my dog. I turn up the TV, trying to drown out all those noises outside once again. 25 minutes later, at 1:30 a.m., I hear a knock on the back door. Now all hell breaks loose with my dog. He's literally about to jump off the couch and dash to the door. I caught him last minute, and just to hold him in place while we're both freaking out. I'm hoping to God that I didn't hear that, hoping that it was just my imagination. My dog started to calm down. I'm thinking maybe I did imagine that. Maybe I blacked out. Maybe there's a period of time where I just don't remember anything. Shortly thereafter, I don't hear any more rustling leaves coming from outside. My dog goes back to being silent and burrows underneath the blankets once more. Cue the doze off to slumberland, only to wake up 30 minutes later to another knock, but now it's on the front door. I literally feel my heart pumping so damn fast. I grab the landline and dial 911. My dog is now at the front door barking ferociously. I reach the adjacent town's 911 emergency service and frantically state what's all happening and why my dog is freaking out. The police from the adjacent town was on their way, but it was going to take a while to get to my house. I stay on the phone with the dispatcher and things start to calm down again. I tell them that I'm pretty sure I can handle it from here at least until the police arrive. I hang up and very carefully look out the side window, only to see a man standing directly in front of the door. No movement from him at all, just a blank stare at the door. I grab the mace and my dog and state very loudly to him, "The police are on their way." I get no response back. I'm thinking this guy has to be on drugs at this point. I end up going to the front door. I yank it open, and the doors in this house have a secondary door with a windowed screen. It's locked and would take some effort to get inside because the screen is triple pane. I look into his face and ask what the hell he wants. Told him the police are about to be here. He just stares blankly, paused for what must have been the longest 20 seconds of my life, opens up his mouth and asks if I want to play a game with him. After that, I immediately shut the door and yell back ferociously, "Absolutely not." I waited in the bedroom, watched him on my front porch for about 5 minutes, just staring blankly at the door. No movement whatsoever. He finally turns around and just walks away. 20 minutes later, the cops show up. I'm describing everything frantically to them. I literally peed my pants earlier. That's how terrifying everything was. The cops then basically state that there's a guy in my town that has schizophrenia and is going through late stages of Alzheimer's, and sometimes he wanders around people's house. Needless to say, they found him and took him back to his caretakers. They asked if I had anywhere else to go, and I basically packed everything up and bolted to my father's house with my dog, and then stayed there for the remainder of the break. Hey everyone, thanks for listening if you stuck around at this point. If you haven't yet, please hit the like button, the subscribe button, and that notification bell to be notified when future episodes come out. If you have a true scary story of your own, feel free to send it to my email or post it to my subreddit. Stalk me on Twitter, you can stalk me on Facebook, and you can also stalk me on Instagram. All those links are below. Hey everybody, how you doing? How's it going? Hopefully you're having a very nice Christmas season and holiday season. Christmas Eve, go enjoy your family, your friends, or just enjoy your time to yourself if that's what you prefer. I don't think we have too many big plans, probably just gonna chill around the house today. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. This will be, I'm not sure if this, no, this probably won't be. There'll be 2 more episodes before the new year next year, but also half of these stories I've read before, at least last year or 2 years ago. I had to use them. It just is what it is. So hopefully most of you haven't heard them yet, and if you have, then you heard them better because they sound a hell of a lot better than they did before. And also if you haven't yet, go check out the collaboration that I did over on Being Scared's channel. Fantastic. I'm sure you probably already have because yeah, but if you haven't, definitely go check that out. Yeah, there's gonna be a lot of changes coming for this channel, and I'm gonna work a hell of a lot harder and be doing a lot more episodes. I'm not just gonna continue to say it, it's actually gonna happen. Now that the renovations are finally done and I think I have a good schedule, I'm also in the process of finally getting a my own studio. And that's actually going to happen now. So all of these things are going to be big and huge and awesome for 2024. So I promise you the content's only going to get better. There's only going to be more content, and I'm going to start vetting the stories a little bit more and fine-tuning him, especially the guy that's finding my stories right now. Fantastic dude, awesome dude, very cool, very good at what he does. I think we just need to pinpoint it better to find the right type of stories that I like and that you as the listener like too. And I think I've got a good idea of what you guys normally like, because you kind of like the same things that I do. So, yeah, with all that being said though, I hope you guys have a fantastic holiday and have a fantastic Christmas if you celebrate it. Again, enjoy the time with your family, your friends, yourself, whatever. Have a couple drinks, have some hot cocoa, drink some eggnog, watch your favorite Christmas movie, sit your ass on the couch, put your feet up, and enjoy yourself. And I will see you all in the next episode next week. I can't remember exactly what theme that's going to be, but you'll see it when I see it, and you'll know it when I know it, because you'll see it. And yeah, I don't know what I'm saying. I'm rambling. I love you all. Cheers.